Well, thank you everybody to be here with us today. Good morning and good afternoon. That's one of our activities within the German Atlantic Network, the Russian-Ukrainian War, regional and global consequences. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the Policy Center of the New South for being our host today, and all the team that's behind this initiative. Here's the deal. We are six think tanks in the German Atlantic Network, and each country has its own view about the Russian-Ukrainian war, and have been discussing about that all along. So the idea of this small webinar here is give to all of us a flash glimpse of what each country is thinking. So as a dynamics, I'll be asking 4 questions to each of the panelists. Each of one will talk about 3 minutes, just telegraphic information about how the country are positioning itself, is organizing its ideas, is vocalizing its position towards the conflicts. So I'll be starting with the order of the program with Mr. Abdelaziz Ali. Then I'll be passing through to Frank Mateus, then to Lorena Ruano and Eduardo Soller, and finalizing with Carlos Gaspar. In fact, finalizing with me, we'll be talking about Brazil. So first of all, the first question that we are going to account, and we're going to have our colleagues' perspectives, is what are the major impacts to be expected regarding spiraling energy prices, taking account the balance of gains and losses? So, Mr. Ait, your floor is yours for the next 3 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Leonardo. Thanks to our partners for the invitation to be with such a distinguished panelists. So I will try to share with you the perspective of a middle-income economy belonging to the African economists, so to the African continent. So I'm an economist. So you might guess that my presentation will focus mainly on the economics implication of the Russian-Ukrainian war. So there are 3 points I want to share on 3 different horizons. In the short term, as you know, this war is a kind of a classic supply shock in the form of soaring energy and food prices affecting differently African economies. So energy-intensive economies within the country will witness massive surge in export revenues, and others like Morocco will highly actually depend over energy imports, will endure significant stress over the internal and the external imbalances. So with all the uncertainties hovering around the global economy and the risk of supply disruption in critical products such as energy and food, the war has actually exerted additional pressure over commodities prices. So, well, as you know, while before the war, analysts were kind of questioning the persistence of inflation, now we are pretty sure that inflation is bound to stay for different reasons, of course, but the war will add further to this trend. So for energy-intensive economies, the improvement in terms of trade will temporarily provide relief. So for example, for Nigeria, the Budget Act of 2022 was based over a price of oil of $60 only. And now prices are almost the double, or 80% higher than that, and they will hover around that level for the rest of the year. So domestic and external imbalances will be resolved. But the side effect is that all structural issues challenging those countries will be put on hold. And I mean by that reforms, tackling structural transformation of the domestic fabric, the transition to a greener economy in the governance reform, and rent-seeking behavior will be taking the lead at the expense of much more profound transformation. On the other side, we have energy importers. The context is quite challenging for those countries, and the macroeconomic and social stability is threatened. And it comes after, or actually with, the unprecedented COVID shocks. So countries are actually called to come up with innovative approach to cope with the domestic and external imbalances, and mostly to prevent eroding purchasing powers of households and access to affordable foods. So unlike energy-intensive economies, vulnerable economies in this context are tremendously engaged to set the country on a more sustainable path. And here I will take the example of the Moroccan context. A serious project is well on track, aiming to establish a universal social safety net that will abolish eventually the linear subsidizing system and centralize all social programs under one hat. The project was launched during the COVID crisis, and policymakers are now quite aware that these systems are well suited to cushion the social implication of such a crisis. So within this crisis, there are opportunities. Countries such as Morocco and other importers, other energy importers, are trying to fix the framework and adapt more sustainable policies, while energy-intensive economies are going through the same symptoms, the same context that they have witnessed a long time ago, engaging in much more rent-seeking behavior with much more dependence over energy imports. So this is what I can say about this dimension. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very overall view about middle-income African countries and especially Morocco. So let's go into Europe, in Brussels. Frank, what's your view from Brussels?
Thank you, Leonardo. Parts of the trends in Belgium are similar to what we see in other countries, notably in Morocco. So certainly, the issue of inflation is quite present. It's to a large extent linked to the rise of energy prices. There's been direct also political consequences of that the dismantling of nuclear power plants on which Belgium relies mainly to produce energy have been postponed and further kicked down the road. So the exits that were supposed to be happening will not happen so soon. So there's an idea of staying self-sufficient for a longer period of time, depending on nuclear energy, but also to accelerating the EU-wide green transition that's already in progress. So there's additional efforts into that direction. Another important part that drives up inflation to some degree also is the disruption of several value chains into which Belgium is integrated, notably in the automotive sector. So there's car sales have dropped last month 25%, which is partly linked to inflation and so to less purchasing power, but to a large extent, it's just simply linked to the fact that there have not been enough cars that have been produced, or those that have been reserved have not been delivered because there are pieces missing that were partly produced in Ukraine, and so the final assembly in factories in Belgium has not happened. So there's also this issue. Then if we go into the labor market, there we have several repercussions also. With the sectors where there have been a quite high share of Ukrainian workers, construction, also transport, lorry drivers, etc. So we've seen a flux of those returning to their country to be enrolled and enlisted into the war. So there's been a crunch on certain activities, but in return we have a high influx of migrants that would work in different sectors, since there's a big sort of gender reverse, so of men going back to the country and women migrating to countries such as Belgium. So this will certainly have big repercussions on the labor market as well. But whether these will be what they will be in the long term is at this point quite difficult to assess. I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Let's go across the Atlantic right now to Latin America and have Lorena to talk about us from the perspective of Mexico.
Thank you, Leonardo. Thanks to the audience for following us today. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let's say that Mexico is a faraway country from the scenario of war. So really the impact is mainly economic and political, but we do not have this issue, for example, as Frank mentioned, of migration. So let me go to the economic side. Mexico is an oil exporting country. So the rise in prices, in world prices, is benefiting the state company, Pemex, that exports this oil, and it has helped to ease its balance sheet, which is it's the most indebted oil producing company in the world. So this rise is sort of it's helpful for the company. However, Mexico exports crude but imports gasoline. And there we have a big problem. Why? Because the prices of the imports are also rising. And also because the government has decided to increase subsidies for gasoline to consumers at a very high fiscal impact for the government. So in the long run, this is okay as a temporary measure. But if this continues in the middle term, it will have a severe fiscal impact for the government. So that's one thing. The other thing is the scarcity of gas can be expected. Mexico does not produce enough gas for internal consumption. We import most of liquefied gas from the United States. And the problem is that if the US decides to help Europe by diverting these exports of gas to Europe, Mexico will probably face a very strong crunch in its gas availability. And of course, like everybody else, we're dealing with high pressures on inflation, which was already high before the war, but this is certainly aggravating the situation. And it is affecting growth, which has been in the last 3 years, zero. So it's not helping the COVID recovery, certainly. In the political side, and I'll finish with this because I'll talk later more about this, Mexico has had an ambiguous position, and this has had impact, an important impact in its relations with the United States, its powerful northern neighbor, and also with the European Union. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorena. Before sending back the word to Europe, I'll place my intervention here about Brazil because it's quite similar to what's happening in Mexico. Brazil has the energy prices have dual impact in Brazil. Brazil is both an energy producer and energy importer. Brazil exports a lot of oil and a little bit of gas, but more oil. And that has been a windfall, unexpected windfall to the governments, both to some states and to the federal governments, producing states, which is interesting because most of this windfall of cash is fueling right now to elections. We have an election by the end of the year, so they are using much of this money to give some kind of benefits in a way to enhance their probabilities in the elections. The dark side of this problem is that, as the same was happening in Mexico, we have been dealing with a negative trend of high inflation in Brazil and a depreciation of the currency, the Brazilian real. So the Brazilian real was like 3 reais 5 years from here in 2017, and right now managed to almost reach 6 reais, an increase like in 8%, an increase within the dollar. So that alone have been impacting in the price of the gasoline in the pump. And in Brazil, the Petrobras, the second largest indebted oil company in the world, just following by Pemex, which was the first one 4 years ago. They use international prices for the gasoline in the pump, in the gas station. So we Brazilians pay gasoline through the benchmark of the international price, not from the producing in reais, in Brazilian reais. So also the price of the gasoline for Brazilians have been increasing a lot. It was for like on the beginning of the governments of Bolsonaro was like 4.5 reais, and right now is scratching like 8 reais. So it's 90%. Increasing in 4 years. So it's a lot, especially in a country that depends a lot on gasoline and that do not use, for instance, railways a lot. So that issue has been huge in Brazil, especially within the federal governments to the elections. So the president have been trying to couple this issue, deal this issue with this problem with several short-sighted policies, like slashes some of the taxes to small taxes, but slash some of the taxes that the federal government place within the price of the gasoline. But the bulk of the taxes that go on gasoline are state taxes. So he's slicing just a scratch of taxes, not make a huge deal, but impacting in the budget. So it's consuming all those windfall that went from the high prices. So from Brazilian society in general has been a bad deal, the price of the gasoline right now, the oil prices, both because of the problem of the currency and the problem of the increase of gasoline. But the government, some state governments has a windfall of money there but they have been using that to fuel propaganda and elections and small policies to enhance their visibility for the elections. And almost nobody's doing a comprehensive fuel policy to Brazil to try to cope with this volatility. I'll leave it here and I'll go back to Europe. I'll send in the word right now to Spain for Edward Soler. Please, Edward, welcome.
Thank you, Leonardo. So here we could say that Spain, as all the other countries that we have been discussing till now, has been affected economically. And this is like a general trend, but there are also then, similar to what also Frank was saying, in the case of Belgium, and probably our colleague also from Portugal will be presenting, here we are in a different position to Morocco, to Brazil, to Mexico, because we are part of the EU, because we are part of NATO. So there are also some decisions that it's not Spain taking, but the whole of the EU and the whole of the alliance taking, and certainly this puts us in a different situation, and we'll have time to come back to Spain's position in the EU and in NATO later on in the debate. In terms of the impact, so I was saying obviously a clear economic impact, which is most visible when it comes to prices, to inflation. Here we are among the European countries that has been more affected by the inflation. We have one of the highest inflations in the continent, 9.8, almost 2 digits. So only the countries from the Baltic republics, and I think also the Czech Republic, very few others have these levels of inflation. It's twice as much as France. So doubling French inflation. This is mainly due also because the issue with energy prices, and we may have also the opportunity to discuss this also because here we face many things similar to our Portuguese neighbors, and there has been also a cooperation here with Portugal to face these specificities, this Iberian specificity. But yes, and this is, it has been an important role when it comes to these high energy prices, which are also politically and socially very sensitive. They were already sensitive before. So we have also had popular mobilizations, some of which were already being cooked before the war started. So this is not only an economic problem, but a social and a political problem. In a way, also one of the Spain's peculiarities, and also Portuguese peculiarity, which is the facilities in terms of LNG and then regasification. In a way, you may say that Spain and Portugal have become more attractive, in a way also less affected than other parts of the continent that are more dependent from supplies of natural gas from Russia via pipelines. So this is, again, one of the peculiarities. When it comes also to the economic effects, we are a touristic country, a tourist destination, and Russians were among our most wealthiest tourists. So this is an issue, not for the whole of the country, but it may affect some territories or some cities, some touristic destinations. It has an effect also on other territories when it comes to the prices of grain, of cereals, particularly for feeding animals in farming. That's an issue. And again, it could be also socially and politically very, very sensitive. Another peculiarity, we had one of the largest Ukrainian diasporas in Europe before the war. More than 100,000 Ukrainians lived and worked in Spain before the war. So this is an issue. I mean, there is also an emotional link here, but obviously it means also we are one of the countries, despite the long distance, that is receiving a significant amount of refugees because of these family connections. Latest data I saw, it's 130,000 refugees have already arrived to Spain. But as I said, it's not only then the humanitarian and the economic, but also the domestic politics. It has been an issue widely discussed in domestic politics. In principle, where there is an agreement between the mainstream parties, the Socialist Party, the Popular Party, but some divisions among how to stop the war, let's put it that way, within the junior partner of the coalition, Unidas Podemos, and as it happens in also other European member states, with a discussion about the links that our far-right movements now in parliament, Vox, have had also with either Putin or some of its European allies, such as Viktor Orban. And finally, foreign policy. It has implications. Spain will also host the NATO summit in Madrid in June. NATO has become more important. So in a way, the war in Ukraine has changed the meaning of that summit. And interestingly, also for our Moroccan colleagues, we could discuss about whether the war in Ukraine has pushed for this reconciliation between Spain and Morocco. As you know, we had an important bilateral crisis. Some people say that it did because, I mean, Spain perhaps could not afford to have to deal with too many crises at the same time. So Morocco's capacity to put pressure on Spain increased, but also Spain fear of an increased migration and social discontent in the Maghreb and in Africa in general because of the food prices. And how do you deal with such a situation if you cannot have a good cooperative relation with your southern neighbor and also your neighbor in the Atlantic? Because remember that Spain is also in Africa, also because of the Canary Islands. And there obviously also this Atlantic dimension is extremely important. And I will stop here. Thank you, Leonardo.
Thank you very much, Edward. And now finally for the last position in this first round for Dr. Carlos Gaspar from Portugal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think most everything has been said about the economic impact and the impact on energy costs. We have a lower inflation than in Spain, and the Portuguese authorities are in denial about the impact of inflation on the medium and long term, but we are convinced that it will be a structural issue in the medium and longer term. As Edward said, we have a specific position on energy, which has been concerted with Spain. The two countries went together to Brussels to define a specific arrangement on the rise of energy prices. Portugal is, as Spain, mostly dependent on Algeria for its gas and on Nigeria for its oil. So we have not had a problem of supplies, just a problem of rising prices, which have, of course, an important industrial impact and social impact. As in the case of Spain, and even more so in a proportional sense, we have a very strong Ukrainian expatriate community. We have about 40,000 Ukrainians. It's the second largest immigrant community in Portugal. It has a very good reputation. It's very well integrated into the Portuguese society. So we have had several thousand immigrant refugees coming into Portugal. And again, there is a very strong movement of solidarity vis-a-vis the refugees. Some come through their families, others come through other social and civilian, even church networks. There is a stream of small groups going to Poland to pick up refugees and bring them back to Portugal. I don't know if some of them will stay in Spain or just come to Portugal, but there is a very strong movement of solidarity vis-à-vis the Ukrainians. Politically, I was surprised by the strong support for the Ukrainian side in the facing the Russian invasion. There is a very strong consensus among political parties in support of Ukraine. President Zelensky, as we speak, is addressing the Portuguese parliament to the protest of the Portuguese Communist Party, which is an old-style Stalinist communist party, our special relic, if you will. But even on the far left, even on the radical left, there has been a moderate support for the Ukrainian side and the movement towards separating themselves from the Russian aggression. Our extreme right party, unlike Vox, does not have any kind of links to Putin's Russia. I don't know why. I'm not an expert on this. It's a small party. It's not a strong. I think it's smaller and weaker than the Vox party, and certainly much weaker than the Front National in Spain. But they have been very strong in condemning the Putin war in Ukraine. So it's only the Communist Party, the Portuguese Communist Party, that is protesting at the Zelensky speaking in Russia, and even the Communist Party has not come out in support of the invasion. They have this ambiguous position, a bit like the Chinese Communist Party position. They do not condemn Russia, and they do not support the invasion. It's not an easy act, but there you have it. So I think that this is it from Portugal. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, I'll close the first round of questions. We try to focus a little bit more on economics. Now we're moving to politics slash geopolitics. Some of you have already touched upon it, but we can have a more structured answer in this round. So the second round question is, do you think that this crisis will accentuate a world division between the two superpowers, with Russia siding with China, and how, and so if so, how your country would deal with this new power dynamic? I'll again refer the question first to our colleague Abdelaziz. So if you could give us the Moroccan perspective.
Okay, so thank you. So I will share with you, in fact, the implication of this new war on the positioning of Africa and this new framework. So I think that's the isolation of the Russian economy has actually pushed it to seek alliances in the East, especially with China, which will likely deepen further the fracture of the economic system, in which African countries might be forced in a certain way to choose a side. And I think this will have tremendous implication for the architecture of economic and trade ties. So I think, in my sense, this is at least in the short term, this is unlikely to happen. And it will depend on the outcome of this war and how Russia would deal with this, with all the pressure coming from the West. But we believe that there are some opportunities for Africa that can seize in this turmoil. Africa has been praised by the developing, the emerging powers in this 21st century, and this trend will, I think, deepen further. So everything will depend on the posture of the African continent, on the strength of the internal front, and to what extent the continent could have one common and homogeneous position. But I think that's now we're entering a new era where all the countries will seek even more partnership with the African continent. And in this context, Africa can play a role in attracting the best, I would say, the best offer, and try to seize this opportunity. And all these trends have been observed well beyond this crisis and before the COVID crisis, but this trend will certainly exacerbate. So Africa has an opportunity to seize, and I think it will depend on its status and what the negotiation that we'll have with all different partners. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Going back again to Frank.
Yes, thank you. So this is the first part of the question is fairly easy to address. Brussels is headquarters of NATO and of the EU, so there's no debate whatsoever with which side Belgium should side with. This doesn't mean that Belgium has always been completely faithful to the US. Belgium was among the countries that opposed the invasion in Iraq 20 years ago. So this doesn't mean unconditional support for the US position, but I think in this situation it's pretty clear where that non-alignment is not an option, and I think colleagues from Lisbon and Barcelona will probably see it similarly. Where the division arises is more is on a different front, both within Belgian politics, but also looking at the EU institutions. There is more of a division between the more hardliner approach of those countries that are not with us are against us. So using the position of third countries, whether they are supporting, whether they're neutral, as a sort of test for alliance, and so to say, well, if countries are not supporting us in this moment, which we feel is an existential crisis or to Europe, then this should have consequences in terms of development aid, in terms of trade preferences, in terms of political support also, and we should tighten the relationships with these countries. So there's one what used to be more of a faction, but that is gaining momentum. And on the other side, you have, say, the more pragmatic approach that is more saying, well, let's keep foreign policy, or let's keep the Ukraine issue separate from our other interests that we might have with third countries, and not let this interfere, so that, for instance, that the relationship with China should not depend on whether they keep a sort of non-aligned position or not, but that there are other factors that are more important to determine how the relationship should go on forth. So I think that's that's probably a bigger rift and a more heated debate, rather than questioning, well, which side should we be on, the US or Russia and China. Thank you.
Great. Lorena, how can the Mexico position itself being so close to US?
Okay, as you just mentioned, Mexico is very close to the US. We share a border. It's certainly our most important foreign policy relationship. However, Mexico has had an ambiguous position, as I mentioned in my first intervention. In the UN Security Council, where Mexico is now sitting together with Brazil, representing Latin America, Mexico has aligned with Western positions and with US positions. However, in the vote that was carried out in the United Nations Human Rights Council to expel Russia, Mexico abstained, together with a number of Latin American countries. And this is certainly signaling a degree of, let's say, equidistance or trying to show, especially for internal purposes, for the internal audience, that Mexico is kind of independent of the United States. The president has said that Mexico remains neutral in the conflict, that Mexico will not participate in the embargo. And recently, like a couple of weeks ago, in Parliament, a group of deputies formed a group of friendship with Russia. This triggered a very strong reaction from the US embassy and the ambassador, and also some United States congressmen called to cancel the visas of the deputies who signed up to this group. Immediately, some of them dropped out of the group. So it has had, it is an important issue. Mexico, in what is reminiscent of the Cold War, is trying to follow a policy of equidistance, trying to show that it has some margin for independence. Clearly, Mexico, between the US and China, has to side with the US. You know, it's our most important partner. 80% of our exports plus go to the United States. We have, you know, 30 million Mexicans live in the United States, etc. So most of this ambiguity will come rhetorically and symbolically. But I don't think that there will be more stronger ways to show that there is. Let me show, for example, an example is the participation in the embargo. Mexico has virtually no trade with Russia whatsoever. So participating or not in the embargo is really not going to make a difference. It's not going to affect the conflict, but it is a way to signal independence that is not costly for anyone, really. With regard to China, Mexico has a very, very tenuous relationship in economic terms with China. And in this, it is different from most of Latin America. We have very little investment from the Chinese in the country, and we only import things from them. We don't export anything to China, or very few exports to China. This is in contrast, for example, to Brazil and Argentina, which export a lot of commodities. So Mexico really will be siding with the US with this kind of symbolic and political sort of gestures to show that it has some independence. And let me just finish with saying that Mexico is currently missing out the opportunity of nearshoring that this trade war between China and the United States has brought, because there is a hostile environment for investment currently in the country. And therefore, the companies from the US, which are trying to bring back the production chains closer to home, have not been choosing Mexico to do it. And this is really a lost opportunity, and it has to do with the populist policies of the current government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorena. Going back to European Union, Edward.
Yes. So the easiest thing to say is that Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister, is in Kiev today, visiting Kiev with the Danish Prime Minister as well. They just met a few hours ago with President Zelensky, and Spain announced the shipment of 200 tons of military equipment, the largest supply Spain has given to Ukraine so far. So similar to Belgium and Portugal, as we will listen from Carlos probably soon. I mean, there is no reserves in the position of support to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian government, financially, politically, and also militarily. Also support to the European Union and NATO allies that are closer to Russia. So in that sense, also before the war, Spain reinforced its participation and its involvement in the NATO operations in the Baltic states and in Bulgaria. And also there has been also communication with Turkey in that respect, and also no reserves regarding the sanctions on Russia. And even for a country like Spain that it's not very keen on sanctions normally, I mean, it's one of those countries that will not veto a sanction in the EU because, I mean, Spain doesn't want to be perceived as a, as a troublemaker. So if there is the consensus it goes with the flow. But in this sense, I mean, here Spain has been among the countries that has been on the forefront and saying, no, I mean, we go ahead with the sanctions. Not announcing them before decisions were taken, that's perhaps a peculiarity. So when there were, there was kind of this rush, okay, who's closing the airspace quicker? No, Spain wanted to always say that it was the result of a commonly agreed position at the level of the EU. But then in the discussions in the council, I mean, Spain has not created any major issue or any reservation on something regarding these sanctions. Why? Because of what we said before. Mainly, which is that probably it is less, although very much affected economically, but it's less exposed when it comes to the energy. But we could also add additional factors. I don't know, probably this is the one I mentioned is the most relevant, but it helps us, it helps the government to get closer, to be perceived as a more solid ally by the other states, but also by the United States. And that was an important aspect also for Sanchez. And you could say also that there is a normative dimension in the position of principles by the government. And here just, to emphasize this point about the fact how Spain channels this response in this multilateral framework, EU and NATO, it is important also to take into account not only that Spain will host the NATO summit in June in Madrid, but also that Spain will be the EU term president of the Council of the EU in 2023. So that's also something. I mean, it's important. The other members are looking at you to see how much also. I mean, how well will they perceive you also as the EU term presidency of the Council of the EU back then. And as I said, also there is this issue about hosting and also being part also of the discussion about how we deal together with the refugee crisis, with the energy crisis, with the economic crisis, but how we do it together, not alone, not as a member state. That would be the main peculiarity of the EU, but precisely because we are part of the EU and a committed member in the EU and NATO. The question you posed, Leonardo, I mean, whether Spain could hesitate? No, on the contrary, it's very clearly aligned on one side.
Great, thanks, Eduardo. And what about Portugal, Dr. Carlos Gaspar? What can you tell us about Portugal?
Well, much the same thing. The equidistance, of course, is not an option for a NATO member state or a EU member state. This the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the pressure against NATO allies, the pressure against Sweden and Finland makes this a European war, and it is felt by Portugal, even if we are somewhat far from the front lines. Or this is well perceived in Portugal as a European war. As I mentioned, there is a strong political consensus on this issue. With the exception of the Communist Party, even the radical left, the equivalent of Unidas Podemos or something like that, is not out of this consensus, although it's less enthusiastic in its solidarity with the Ukrainians. Portugal has sent. Has reinforced its positions, its participation on the NATO Baltic operations, It has sent troops to Romania. We leave Bulgaria to Spain, but we are concentrating in Romania. And of course, we have approved all the sanctions in the European Union as other member countries. There is no impact and no movement towards establishing any kind of conditionality as to relations with third countries. Angola and Mozambique both abstained in the UN vote condemning Russia, and this was, of course, people took notice of that, but there is no linkage between our relations, our bilateral relations, or our relations within the Portuguese-speaking countries community and the issue of the war in Europe. Your question, however, was somewhat larger, I think, and yes, I do think that the crisis will accentuate the separation between Russia and China on the one hand, and the United States and its European and Asian allies on the other hand. I think this is a very strong trend. We have spoken mainly about the Ukrainian issue and the Russian issue, but there is also a spillover in relations with China. Public opinion on China has changed a lot in the last 2-3 years. And of course, the fact that China is aligned with Russia on this, on the Ukrainian war will further change the European and Portuguese opinion vis-a-vis China. Of course, again, we do not have an option of being equidistant in this issue, but it's different in the relations with Russia and the relations with China. And this is not only the case of Portugal. Russia is an aggressor. It has been identified as the major threat to European security in EU official documents, in the new strategic doctrine of the European Union, the strategic compass of the European Union. It will be further identified as the main threat to European security in the NATO document that will be approved in the Madrid summit in a few months. But China is partially as a separate subject on this, and is not identified, unlike in the United States, is not identified as a comparative threat. It is identified by the European Union as both a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival, but not as a threat. And the same thing in the case of the strategic compass, the EU strategic compass, which was adopted last month. Portugal, however, will always have a very restrained position vis-a-vis China in the bilateral relations between Portugal and China. We still have a sizable minority of Portuguese in Macau, and we have an agreement on the transition of on Macau with the People's Republic of China, and we try to avoid any kind of strong position condemning China outside of the European institutions. So bilaterally, we will be rather cautious in relations with China because of this specific issue of Macau and the Portuguese minority in Macau. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, from Brazilian perspective, it's interesting because it's somehow, if you analyze all the positions that we have in Brazil, we have clearly two different positions. I would say even two different players dealing with the Ukrainian war. We have the president with his own agenda, and we have the foreign ministry with its own agenda. From the present perspective, President Bolsonaro has been nearly radioactive in the last few years. I mean, it's almost an internal joke how Bolsonaro is not being received and not being talked to. Most world leaders will go to G20, Davos, or even General Assembly in New York. Almost nobody wants to talk to him. At least nobody from the democratic family of countries in the world. He has been able to meet with Saudi Arabia in countries, or Hungary, with Orbán at least in Europe. But finding Russia to receive Bolsonaro in the beginning of the year was key to him to position himself, as a world leader. I mean, I am here being received by one of the biggest leaders in one of the biggest countries, at least our biggest military countries in the world. So, which was important to him to show that he was not alone, he was not isolated in the world. Again, especially facing elections in October, a month from an election. So this idea that he has been criticized a lot, that he was unable, since Trump left office, he was unable to engage with almost anybody in the world. So his foreign policy was almost non-existent. Being able to meet with Putin was very important to him, to say that he was still being received by countries, relevant countries in the world, which is interesting because he basically did not sign anything in Russia. I mean, he went to Russia and didn't come back with any policy, any program, or almost anything relevant, at least. And there is the position of the foreign ministry that has been very institutional, very traditional, trying to not engage in position itself, being very equidistant between the two poles, try to be very vocal about the needs to reduce violence, to stop violence, in fact, and go to the negotiating table. Although in the General Assembly, within the UN, Brazil has been voting with the Western countries in general in almost everything. But again, it has been very cautious to support sanctions and very cautious to support the banning or suspension of Russia from more agnostic institutions such as World Bank, the Monetary Fund, and others. So the idea, again, is trying to place Brazil within the very traditional paradigm with autonomy. Brazil is supposed to be, since decades, since the Cold War, Brazil has been trying to organize its foreign policy as an autonomous position. Autonomy through distance between US and Soviet Union, and later on with President Lula, autonomy through diversification. I mean, talking to Western countries, but also talking to other countries. And that has led Brazil to the BRICS. And so Russia has a very special relationship with Brazil within the BRICS. And that, again, is a very interesting and important obstacle. So it's almost impedes Brazil to be very harsh with Russia unless it's need to be. So within the BRICS, we have to try to be more soft in our positions, to not implode this project that we have been investing a lot. And that's have been very interesting, because since Brazil is somehow in the west side of the hemisphere, at least for Brazilians in general, we believe that we are Westerners. We have been suffering a lot of pressure from both Europe and especially US. As Frank has said before, there is some hardliners in Europe and in US that have been pressuring a lot Brazil, both presidents and both the foreign ministry, to position itself by condemning Russia in all stances it's possible. So again, we have this dual position in Brazil. The president is clearly with his own agenda of elections and have been avoiding to criticize Russia because he wished to capitalize upon Russia, that Russia is a relevant player, and so he's being received. So he's a world leader. And within the foreign ministry, they have been trying to be very institutional, very traditional, not trying to make much move and try to be avoid. I mean, it's just like they're trying to expect people to forget that we are here. So only taking the necessary steps, only taking the necessary positions to not create big waves with both the West and Russia and perhaps China. So I think that's more or less the general position in Brazil. Okay, so I have just closed the second round. As we are very short on time, I will merge the last two questions and just pose one last question to everybody, okay? So the last question is, how do you perceive the evolutions in the European Union? I mean, European Union, we are all part of European Union or very close to European, like Brazil, Mexico, and Morocco. So how can we think that our relation with the European Union will be impacted from our country position? And I'll add to that, how our countries are feeling about engaging sanctions that European Union have and US somehow have been trying to impose on Russia through this conflict. So again, I will start through Morocco's. Professor Abdelaziz, you can start.
Sorry, I think I missed your questions. There was some technical issues.
No problem at all. I can repeat. In a nutshell, the question I'm merging the fourth and the third question to make just one final question, in the sense that how our countries perceive the evolutions of our relationship with European Union. I mean, how we are to engage European Union, how European Union is engaging Russia in this conflict, and especially through the lens of the sanctions, how we are engaging in sanctions. Are we engaging in sanctions? Are those, and for the European Union colleagues, are those sanctions enough, or you are ready to escalate then? And if you are ready to demand from other players such as Mexico, Morocco, and Brazil to engage in those sanctions. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you for the question. I think for Morocco, the position that Morocco has been handling right now is quite neutral in this. Although it says that it's with the international law that preserves the sovereignty of a country. But if I may focus on the relation that Morocco will see through this crisis with Europe, I think that, as my colleague as Edouard said, on this relation between Morocco and Europe, we believe that it's going to evolve, maybe not due to this crisis, but due to the interest, the economic relation that we are handling with Europe, and also the potential that we have in this very long relation. As you know, Morocco is enjoying a very advanced status with Europe. We are in a free trade agreement since 2001, and we're seeking a very more profound form of integration. There have been negotiations around the very profound economic relation, profound free trade agreement, but negotiations have been stalling lately for different reasons. But we believe that Morocco is quite engaged to push it even further, especially with this context. As Edouard said, there was some political disagreements with Germany, with Spain also, but I think that they have been solved. Some analysts actually have pointed that Morocco is enjoying a kind of strength position in this context. But I think that if you see the historic relation between Morocco and Spain, and also France and Germany, they have been quite cyclical. But the trend, in the long-term trend, they have been improving. And now, in the past, Morocco has had very important economic and trade relations with France, but lately Spain, for example, is becoming the first economic partner, despite all the crisis, despite all the issues that we are facing now. So I think that the future for Morocco is to increase its integration with Europe. Although we are seeking diversification with other partners, I don't think that Morocco will take a position in this crisis, for example, to seize its economic relation with Russia or other powers. We've been a major provider of agricultural products to Russia, especially after the sanctions that Europe have decreed on Russia after the annexion of the Crimea. So Morocco, I think, will still enjoy kind of economic relations, but it will depend, as I said, on this war and the pressure that other countries will exert on Morocco in a way that we need to choose a side. So beside this economic relation, I see that the future with between Morocco and Europe is quite promising. We have some classic roles that Morocco is playing in terms of migration, in terms of stability in the region. But I think in the long run, there is a role that Morocco can play even further with this crisis, is in terms of ensuring the food security. As you know, agriculture is very important sector in Europe, and Morocco is a major provider of fertilizers and phosphates. And as you know, Russia is the biggest player in this sector, and all the sanctions and also the decision of Russia to ban exports of fertilizer. I think Morocco can play a role in providing fertilizers to Europe, especially with the distance, especially with the cost and different comparative advantage that Morocco is witnessing. So we see that the future is quite promising in this sense. And I think that Morocco will integrate more, despite all the diversification process that Morocco is engaging in. I think that Morocco will still be a reliable partner for Europe. Nice copy.
Thank you very much. Frank, how's Brussels dealing with this? I mean, would you evolve a little bit about more how Brussels are engaging other countries in addressing sanctions? Do you expect to have more rounds of sanctions?
Well, to start with the first part of the question on the evolutions in the EU, I think we've seen a very clear rally behind the European flag movement. So I think this is quite clear and probably will last also a bit longer. Of course, there are nuances and there are differences. Not every country has exactly the same position, otherwise it wouldn't be the EU. But generally, one can say that there is a consensus. There is a sort of division of labor. So those countries that, for historical and cultural reasons, are not keen on delivering heavy weapons into an armed conflict, like Germany and Austria, will finance the armies of, will refill the stocks of other countries that are doing so. So there's a clear joint action there, and this is likely to keep on for some time. But as with any crisis, it will wear off at some point, and then differences might rise again, and particularly with the issue of sanctions, as you mentioned. So far, Belgium, like Portugal and Spain and many others, has been full supporter of the sanctions so far. At this point, it's also probably likely to support any further ones. But at some point, we will inevitably see that the media attention will drop at some point. I mean, now it still makes the headlines every day, but this, as we know from other crises, this will diminish at some point, and it will ultimately be a question of how well the EU, but also the individual countries, are managing the effects of the sanctions so far, so the negative ones, because it's clear that there's a diminishment of wealth in European countries. And so what are the social repercussions? How are they being handled? So how is it being assured or not that this does not fuel more inequality, more poverty, that the negative consequences are not disproportionately borne by the poorest sections of societies, which would then create more of a backlash against imposing any more sanctions that would go on top of it. So this is largely, I think, more of a question whether this is implemented in in a socially acceptable manner rather than an ideology question. I think from the idea of ideology, I think Belgium and many other countries would continue to support further sanctions if the war continues to escalate, especially if more war crimes are happening. But then it will become a domestic issue as to negotiating what kind of sanctions are acceptable and not. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Lorena?
Hi, so let me start by saying just that as in Brazil, as you mentioned, Leonardo, in Mexico, we have several foreign policies running at the same time in parallel. There is sort of a polyphony going on with regard to the conflict. On the one hand, we have the foreign ministry, which has led a very sort of traditional, sort of international law kind of position, whereas the president and his party have had more sort of populist kind of policy or positions, not even a policy really. Let me say as well that as similar to other Latin American lefts, and also the Portuguese Communist Party, as was mentioned before, there is sort of a confusion about what Russia is. There is this view that equates Russia with anti-imperialism and this vision of the Cold War, with the Russia being sort of left-wing, etc. And I think a lot of the Latin American left hasn't downloaded the new version of Russia still into their computers to see that Putin is nothing even close to what the USSR used to be. So there is an important sector not just in Mexico, but in Latin America that sort of supports Russia. In addition to this, there is also a lot of misinformation going around, a lot of propaganda from Russian television and in Twitter and in general. And so it is a conflict that has divided public opinion, I think. So this is one of the things that I wanted to make clear, because it translates into this ambiguity. So the thing with the EU, what's happening with the EU? Well, the EU has been quite perplexed by Mexico's ambiguity. Because for the EU, it's quite clear. There has been an aggression, there is a victim, Ukraine is a victim, and it should be helped. And they do not see that for Mexico or for countries in Latin America that simply do not understand how we are not upholding international law and we do not defend the aggressed, the victim of the aggression. So there is sort of a difficulty going on there. Having said that, I have to also put this in a wider context, which is that Mexico's relations with the EU are currently in a historic low. Before the war started, there were rows with Spain, with Germany for climate change, with the European Commission, and also with Austria, because we're asking for some archaeological pieces that are in museums in Europe, and most recently with the European Parliament that criticized the assassination of journalists in Mexico. And there was a big row, diplomatic row going on. So the only bright side has been the cooperation with France in the UN, both in the Security Council and in the General Assembly. But otherwise, the relationship is in a very difficult situation now, and the war in Ukraine is not making it better. I think there is more distancing and less understanding of each other. The treaty that Mexico and the EU finished negotiating in 2020 to upgrade their current association agreement is not going to be signed and ratified in the near future. It's been put in the freezer and it will stay there for a long time. I think that we are currently facing a very, very sort of downward trend in relations with Europe. Mexico, as I mentioned, is not joining the sanctions or the embargo. doesn't really matter because there is very little trade. We also had some Russian tourists and also some Ukrainian ones. Flights with Russia have not been interrupted. However, the airspace is complex to navigate without going through Europe. And so basically, Mexico is open still for Russian tourists, but there has been no help to those who were stranded when the war started and their flights got canceled. And the same with a few Ukrainians who were visiting Mexican resorts. So basically, Mexico is not really doing anything about the tourists, not blocking their arrival nor helping them to return. And so in general, I think that the big picture is going to be defined generally by what happens in the US in the next elections in November. And because there is also this issue of whether Trump is going to come back to power next year. And I think that will be a variable that might change everything that we have been saying today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorena. Edward, now for Spain.
Yeah, it's difficult to speak now after this scary thought that Lorena has put on the discussion. But to answer to the question, so is Spain, the government, ready for more sanctions? Yes, if needed. And some of the sanctions that were discussed in the council and has not yet been approved, I mean, Spain would be among those that would be in favor. I'm thinking about mainly about the issue about coal, gas, oil. As I explained before, I mean, we have less of a dependence. That may explain why it may be easier. Does everyone in the country has the same position? Well, not everyone, but I mean, most of the people are in the same position. But you have, as Lorena was saying, and Carlos before, some segments that in our case are a minority among the extreme left or the radical left in Spain. But in our case, I'd say also it has this dimension of sanctions only harm people, while oligarchs will always find a way, making parallels with other sanctions imposed on Iraq in the 90s or the ones imposed on Cuba. So the embargo, so these things, I mean, for some constituencies in the radical left, this place, but they are not in a position not even to influence the position of the government, despite Unidas Podemos being the junior partner of the government. So it's like a segment of a segment in a way. And then for part of the right, I mean the radical right, then again, it's a difficult situation because in a way, this is an opportunity also to have like a more militaristic rhetoric. This also speaks well in the mindset of part of the constituencies of the party. But at the same time, it's also an opportunity to criticize not that much the government of Spain, but also the EU about this is partly the fault of how we have been doing things till now. So you may have this kind of controversies, but ultimately the position of the government and even of the main opposition party are quite clear. There has been this discussion that you raised also and that Carlos before mentioned about Angola I mean, are we ready then to ask our partners to uphold to the same positions we have? I think we are not. I mean, I could not imagine Spain in its relation with its most important partners in Latin America or in Maghreb or in sub-Saharan Africa saying, no, we won't cooperate with you unless, no. I mean, I don't think that this is not part of the agenda. On top of it, I think we are very much concerned and we understand, and I think this is important, how difficult the situation for some of our partners are in terms of destabilization, social destabilization, but even security destabilization. We are very concerned about the situation in the Sahel, in Mali, where Russia is present. Remember also, as I mentioned, about our proximity, particularly when you integrate into what Spain is, you integrate the Canary Islands, we are very close also to the Sahel. And finally, one just more little comment, I think it's important to see also how the war has modified a little bit our relation with some other European actors. With the Commission, I mean, we want the Commission to see Spain as an ally because we need the Commission president as an ally. It's an opportunity to cultivate relations with those with which relations were not as strong: Baltics, Nordic, Black Sea region, Romania, Bulgaria. So to have also diversified alliances, not only the Franco-German couple. It has consolidated our already excellent relations with Portugal. We see things eye to eye. It has revived some disagreements with people with whom we have had disagreements before: the Dutch, the Netherlands, Prime Minister Rutte, and in a way with France and Italy. It's this always mix of cooperation, because we do cooperate, because they are our normal partners, but also competition, and this competition mainly on the energy front. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Edward. Dr. Carlos Gaspar.
Thank you. I would like first to stress that the European Union institutions have proved to be stronger than expected in facing successive crises. This was the case during the financial crisis back in 2010. This was also the case in the COVID crisis, where the European Commission took on new competencies on the to ensure the supply of vaccines and so on and so forth. And now also the European Union has taken a strong stand in the Ukrainian war, and the European Commission, including Mr. Borrell, have taken not only a strong stand, but they have engaged in buying weapons to supply to the Ukraine. This is unprecedented in our experience in the European Union. So I think that it's important to stress that the European Union is stronger now than it was at the beginning of this series of crises. We do not know how it will perform in the next crisis, but so far it has performed rather well, and surprisingly well for these institutions. Were not really designed to face these crises. So it has shown, European institutions have shown a degree of adaptation, which is, I think, quite remarkable. And relations between the European Union and NATO, and within NATO itself, have also improved. NATO was immersed in a very deep political crisis before the Ukrainian war, even after the election of President Biden. And again, its response to the war has strengthened relations between the allies, and it is now in a stronger position than it was before. In that sense, the European multilateral order, if you will, is stronger now than it was before this Ukrainian crisis, before the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. On the sanctions, yes, of course, we will be ready if the war escalates. If the war goes on, there will be more sanctions. There is a division within the European Union in what regards extending the sanctions to oil and gas. This is especially a problem for Germany. Portugal, and I think Spain, will not take a stand without consulting Germany. There is a socialist solidarity between Lisbon, Madrid, and Berlin, which is an important factor in this process. But the division is there, and it will be increasingly difficult for the Germans to not to cut supplies, energy supplies, if the war goes on. And there is a possibility, of course, that it will that will go on for some time. My last point, I'm well aware that in Latin America, also in the Middle East, my friends see this Ukrainian war as a Cold War conflict. It is not a Cold War conflict. And it is a very bad precedent for international relations all over, when a large state simply invades its neighbor without any kind of pretext, just because it has some kind of ideological fiction about the unity of the Slavic nations, or where the borders should be redrawn. This is a very, very bad precedent, not only for Europe, but for the Middle East, for Africa certainly, and perhaps also for Latin America. So I think that I understand that this is so, that this is seen as a Cold War conflict, but I think this is old thinking, and that the Ukrainian war is a new, opens a new cycle in international relations, and that it is a precedent which is as significant for, as important for Europeans as for other international regions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, from Brazilian perspective, as was in Mexico, Brazil is, its current government is in its all-time low in relation with European Union. We have been since 2019 being bashed a lot, especially because of the deforestation, the forest fires that we had by that time. That led to some spats between President Bolsonaro and Macron, and then later with Madame Merkel. So relationship between Brazil, especially Brazil and European Union, are not at its best. It had led, this quarrel has led to a halt in the negotiations, in the signature of the European Union and Mercosur trade agreements. It's on freezer right now, so and we have no expectations of anything going further until at least President Bolsonaro is still in power, as so we believe here. We can perhaps see a change on this scenario after the elections in October, if there is a change of government. We believe so, at least in Brazil. And that has led also somehow strengthening the position of Brazil, not favoring sanctions. I mean, if there is sanctions within the Security Council towards Russia, against Russia, I believe only then Brazil might abstain from the sanctions. Not vote against it, but abstain from it. Not again, vote toward it. As I said, Russia is somehow a special country, a key country in our foreign politics for a couple of decades at least, within the BRICS umbrella. Russia is not a key trade partner in the sense of volume, but it's a key trade partner in the sense of the components of the trade. A third of the Brazilian fertilizers come from Russia and Belarus, a little more from Belarus, but a third from Russia. That means that we need a lot from fertilizer from Russia to keep up with our agriculture efficiency, which is key to Brazilian economics. So until Brazil is managed to couple with this, deal with this vulnerability, Russia is key to the Brazilian developments in that sense. But again, it's not a huge volume of trade. So Russia is like the 20th, 15th trade partner of Brazil. So not that much. So I can't see anything very new happening in the near future between our relations. I mean, even if Brazil, that's this perception of the governments. Even if Brazil agreed with everything that came from the European Union and US, condemning Russia, sanctioning Russia, that would not generate dividends to Brazil, so we can improve its view towards Russia, towards European Union. I mean, the damage has been done with these governments towards European Union. So the perception of the governments that it's better to abstain, it's better not to meddle too much, it's better to be equidistant, and expect everything to go away, and then we can check what we can do. So that's the general idea that we can analyze, interpret from the government positions. So with that, and a few minutes after our time, I'd like to thank you everybody for all your views. I mean, we have been excellent, very telegraphed, but with a lot of information. I think that our viewers learned a lot today. So thank you very much for our colleague Abdelaziz Al-Ali, Frank Mateus, Lorena Ruano, Eduardo Soler, and Carlos Gaspar. Thank you very much again to the Policy Center for the New South for hosting us here today, all its staff that make it possible, and to the European Union through the program that have been helping our Geomoni Atlantic Network in engaging all these activities that have been doing in this program. Check please the YouTube channel in the descriptions that we have the website of the projects with everything that we have been publishing and all the work that have been done in the past couple of years. So, and again, thank you very much for all the audience for being with us right now. So, bye-bye to everybody and have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Obrigado.
Bye.
Shukran.
Muchas gracias. Hasta luego. Bye-bye.